The air in the congressional hearing room was thick with tension. Every seat was filled. Cameras lined the walls, and millions watched from home. But nobody, not the seasoned politicians, not the veteran journalists, not even the legal scholars, expected what was about to happen. Representative Jasmine Crockett, the 4- or 3-year-old civil rights attorney from Texas, sat at the witness table in a sharp navy blue suit, her notes spread before her. Across from her, displayed on the massive screen behind the panel, was the stern face of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. He wasn't physically present, but his recent controversial opinion was. And today, Crockett had come prepared to dismantle it piece by piece. The committee chairman's gavel struck. "Representative Crockett, you have the floor." She stood, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, I'm going to show this committee and the American people exactly why Justice Alito's reasoning in his recent opinion doesn't just fail legal scrutiny. It contradicts his own words, his own precedents, and basic constitutional principles he once claimed to defend." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Conservative members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't supposed to be an attack on a sitting Supreme Court justice, but Crockett wasn't backing down. "And I have the receipts," she added, holding up a stack of documents. Justice Alito's own writings from cases spanning 3 decades. Every single one contradicts what he just put in writing last month. The room exploded. Cameras flashed. Reporters frantically typed. This wasn't just testimony. This was about to become a masterclass in legal takedown. Before we dive deeper into this explosive moment, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett is and why so many people had underestimated her. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett didn't come from political royalty or legal dynasty. She worked her way through college and law school, eventually becoming a civil rights attorney in Texas. For years, she fought in courtrooms defending people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers, taking on police misconduct cases, fighting for voting rights, and standing up to powerful interests that thought they were untouchable. When she first ran for the Texas House of Representatives in 2020, political insiders gave her little chance. But Crockett won, and she won decisively. 2 years later, she was in Congress representing Texas's 30th District. Still, many in Washington saw her as just another freshman representative. Young, outspoken, but inexperienced on the national stage. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Crockett had built her reputation on preparation. As a trial attorney, she knew that emotions could sway a jury, but evidence won cases. She approached Congress the same way, always armed with facts, always ready with citations, always prepared for a fight. On the other side of this confrontation stood Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, or at least his judicial legacy did. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 2006 by President George W. Bush, Alito had spent nearly 2 decades as one of the court's most conservative voices. He was known for his originalist interpretations of the Constitution, his skepticism of federal power, and his staunch conservative positions on issues like abortion, voting rights, and religious liberty. Alito wasn't just any judge. He was a Supreme Court justice, one of 9 people with lifetime appointments who shaped American law. His opinions carried immense weight. When he wrote a majority opinion, it became the law of the land. When he wrote a dissent, it influenced legal thinking for generations. But recently, Alito had authored an opinion that sparked outrage across the political spectrum. Critics called it judicial activism. Legal scholars called it a departure from established precedent. Civil rights advocates called it dangerous. And Jasmine Crockett called it exactly what it was: inconsistent, contradictory, and indefensible based on Alito's own previous writings. This wasn't just an academic debate between a congresswoman and a Supreme Court justice. The stakes were enormous, affecting millions of Americans. Alito's recent opinion dealt with voting rights, specifically whether states could impose certain restrictions that critics argued would disproportionately affect minority voters. The decision had weakened federal oversight of state election laws, essentially giving states more power to set their own rules without federal interference. For conservatives, this was about states' rights and preventing federal overreach. For progressives and civil rights advocates, it was about protecting the fundamental right to vote from discriminatory practices. But Crockett's argument wasn't about liberal versus conservative. It was about consistency. It was about whether a Supreme Court justice could simply ignore his own previous positions when it suited his current ideology. If we can't trust the Supreme Court to be consistent, Crockett had said in a previous interview, then we don't have the rule of law. We just have the rule of whoever has power at the moment. That's what made this confrontation so important. This wasn't just political theater. It was about the integrity of the American judicial system itself. Crockett began methodically. She pulled up the first document on the screen behind her, a 2013 opinion authored by Justice Alito himself in the case of Shelby County versus Holder. In this opinion, Crockett explained, her voice carrying across the silent chamber, Justice Alito argued that federal oversight of state election laws was necessary precisely because of the history of racial discrimination in voting. He wrote, and I quote, "The record of voting discrimination in covered jurisdictions remains extensive and troubling." She paused, letting that sink in. Conservative committee members watched wearily. They knew where this was going. That was Justice Alito in 2013, Crockett continued. Now, let's look at his opinion from last month. Another document appeared on screen. Crockett read directly from it. The court finds no compelling evidence that federal oversight remains necessary. The problems of the past do not justify continued federal intrusion into state sovereignty. The contradiction was stark. Gasps echoed through the room. So, which is it? Justice Alito Crockett asked, her voice sharp now. Is the record of discrimination extensive and troubling, requiring federal oversight? Or is there no compelling evidence that such oversight is needed? You can't have it both ways, a Republican committee member interrupted. Representative Crockett, aren't you taking Justice Alito's words out of context? Those were different cases with different facts. Crockett didn't miss a beat. Thank you for that question, Congressman. Let me address that right now. Crockett pulled up another set of documents, this time side-by-side comparisons of the facts in both cases. Both cases involved Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, she explained. Both cases dealt with states that had histories of voting discrimination. Both cases examined whether federal oversight was still justified. She clicked to another slide showing statistical data. In fact, between 2013 and now, there have been over 1,800 documented cases of voting rights violations in states formerly covered by Section 5. That's not fewer violations. That's more violations than existed when Justice Alito said federal oversight was necessary. The chamber erupted. Supporters applauded. Critics shouted objections. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, order, he called out. Representative Crockett will continue without interruption. But conservative members weren't backing down. Another congressman leaned into his microphone. Representative, you're cherry-picking data. Justice Alito is one of the most respected jurists in America. Are you really suggesting he's being dishonest? Crockett's eyes flashed. This was the moment she'd been preparing for. I'm not suggesting anything, Crockett replied, her voice calm but forceful. I'm showing you, with Justice Alito's own words, that his current position contradicts his previous position. And I'm not done. She pulled up yet another document, this one from Alito's 2006 confirmation hearings before the Senate. During his confirmation, Crockett explained, then Judge Alito was asked specifically about his judicial philosophy. He said, and this is a direct quote from the official transcript, a judge should not approach cases with an agenda or predetermined outcomes. We follow the law where it leads us, even if we personally disagree with the result. She looked directly at the camera. Those are beautiful words, principled words. But here's the problem. Justice Alito's recent opinion doesn't follow the law where it leads. It follows his preferred outcome and works backward to justify it. A Democratic member of the committee spoke up supporting Crockett. "Representative, you're making a powerful argument. Can you elaborate on the legal standard Justice Alito is supposed to follow?" Crockett nodded. "Absolutely. The legal principle is called stare decisis. It means judges should follow precedent unless there's a compelling reason to overturn it. Justice Alito himself has written extensively about the importance of stare decisis. But, in this recent opinion, he ignores decades of precedent with no substantial justification. For the next several minutes, Crockett systematically dismantled Alito's reasoning. She showed how Alito's opinion ignored relevant Supreme Court precedent from cases he himself had joined, how his quarter interpretation of the Constitution's text contradicted his own originalist methodology, how his dismissal of contemporary discrimination evidence conflicted with his previous statements about judicial fact-finding, how his reliance on states' rights arguments was inconsistent with his positions in other federalism cases. Each point built on the last. Each contradiction was more damning. The tension in the room grew with every revelation. Conservative members tried to push back, but Crockett had an answer for everything. She had clearly spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating every counter-argument, ready with citations and evidence. One Republican congressman, growing visibly frustrated, finally said, "Representative Crockett, you seem to have a personal vendetta against Justice Alito. This isn't about the law. This is political. That was a mistake, and Crockett was about to make him regret it." Crockett set down her papers. She didn't need them anymore. This part she had memorized. "Congressman, you want to talk about what's political?" Her voice was steel. "Let me tell you what's political. What's political is a Supreme Court justice abandoning his own stated principles when those principles no longer serve his preferred outcomes. What's political is ignoring evidence of ongoing discrimination because acknowledging it would be inconvenient. What's political is claiming to be an originalist, except when original understanding doesn't support your conclusion." She paused, then continued, her voice rising with controlled passion. "I'm a civil rights attorney, Congressman. I've spent my career fighting for people whose voices aren't heard in rooms like this. And what I've learned is that when powerful people can't defend their actions on the merits, they attack the motives of those who question them." The room went absolutely silent. Even her critics had stopped talking. "So, no, Congressman, this isn't personal. This isn't political. This is about accountability. Supreme Court justices have lifetime appointments. They answer to no one. The only check on their power is public scrutiny and the force of legal argument. And today I'm exercising that check." Then Crockett did something unexpected. She pulled out one more document. This one she said she hadn't planned to use. But given the congressman's accusation, she felt it was necessary. "This," she said, holding up a legal brief, "is a brief filed by Justice Alito when he was an attorney in the Reagan administration. In it, he argued for robust federal enforcement of civil rights laws, including voting rights. He wrote, and I'm quoting directly, "Federal oversight is essential to preventing states from circumventing constitutional protections for minority voters." The revelation landed like a bombshell. "That was Samuel Alito as a government lawyer," Crockett continued. "That was Samuel Alito as a lower court judge. That was Samuel Alito during his confirmation hearings. But that's not the Samuel Alito we're seeing now." She let that hang in the air for a moment. So what changed? The law didn't change. The 15th Amendment still guarantees the right to vote. The facts didn't change. Discrimination still exists. The only thing that changed was Justice Alito's political convenience. Even some conservative members of the committee looked uncomfortable. Now, Crockett had done more than just point out inconsistencies. She had shown a decades-long pattern of Alito abandoning principles he once held when those principles conflicted with conservative outcomes. Outside the hearing room, social media exploded. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's testimony were trending on every platform. Crockett Vizelo became the #1 trend on Twitter. News networks interrupted regular programming to show highlights. Legal scholars from across the political spectrum weighed in. Even some conservative commentators had to admit that Crockett's argument was devastating. I don't agree with Representative Crockett's politics. One conservative legal analyst said on Fox News, but she just gave a masterclass in legal argumentation. Those contradictions, she pointed out, are real, and they're troubling. A progressive commentator on MSNBC was more blunt. Jasmine Crockett just did what the Senate Judiciary Committee should have done during Alito's confirmation hearings. She held him accountable for his own words. As her time in the hearing wound down, Crockett delivered her closing statement. By now, every person in the room was hanging on her words. "I want to be clear about what I'm saying today," she began. "I'm not calling for Justice Alito's impeachment. I'm not questioning his intelligence or his legal credentials. What I'm questioning is his consistency, his intellectual honesty, and his commitment to the principles he claims to hold dear. The Supreme Court's legitimacy depends on the American people believing that justices are calling balls and strikes, not changing the rules based on who's at bat. Today, I've shown that Justice Alito has changed the rules. I've shown it with his own words, and I've shown it with irrefutable evidence." She gathered her papers, preparing to leave the witness table. But she had one more thing to say. The Supreme Court is the guardian of our Constitution. But who guards the guardians? We do. The American people do. And today I've done my part. The hearing room erupted in applause from both sides of the aisle. Even some Republicans were nodding in acknowledgement. Crockett had done something rare in modern American politics. She had made a purely legal argument so compelling that it transcended partisan lines. Within 24 hours, Crockett's testimony had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. It became one of the most watched congressional testimonies in modern history. Major newspapers ran front-page stories. The New York Times headline read, "Texas Rep exposes Supreme Court contradictions." The Washington Post went with Crockett's legal clinic, a lesson in judicial consistency. Even the Wall Street Journal, generally conservative-leaning, acknowledged, "Congresswoman raises serious questions about Alito opinion." Legal journals published immediate analysis. Harvard Law Review's blog posted an article titled "The Crockett Challenge: Examining Judicial Consistency on the Supreme Court." Yale Law Journal's online edition published a symposium with multiple scholars weighing in on the contradictions Crockett had identified. The Supreme Court itself maintained its typical silence. Justices rarely respond to public criticism, and Alito was no exception. But sources close to the court told reporters that the justices were well aware of the controversy, and that it had sparked private discussions among them. Politically, Crockett's testimony had significant effects. Progressive activists and civil rights organizations rallied around her arguments, using them as a rallying cry for judicial reform. "Representative Crockett showed us exactly what accountability looks like," said the president of the NAACP in a statement. She demonstrated that even Supreme Court justices must answer to the Constitution and their own stated principles. Civil rights groups launched a new campaign called Hold the Court Accountable. Using Crockett's testimony as a centerpiece, the campaign focused on educating the public about Supreme Court decisions and their impact on voting rights, reproductive rights, and other civil liberties. On the conservative side, reactions were mixed. Some commentators doubled down in defense of Alito, arguing that Crockett was engaging in political grandstanding. Others, however, admitted that her arguments had merit and called for the court to be more transparent about its reasoning. "I'm a conservative, and I support conservative judicial outcomes," wrote one prominent right-leaning legal commentator. But Crockett is right that we need consistency. If we celebrate originalism and precedent when they support our positions, we can't abandon them when they don't. Inspired by Crockett's testimony, several members of Congress introduced new legislation. One bill would require Supreme Court justices to file detailed explanations when departing from their own previous reasoning. Another would establish an ethics code for Supreme Court justices similar to what exists for lower federal courts. Neither bill was expected to pass in a divided Congress, but they sparked important conversations about judicial accountability and transparency. In several states, legislators introduced resolutions calling on Congress to pass voting rights protections to address the concerns raised in Crockett's testimony. Some states began exploring their own state-level protections to fill gaps created by recent Supreme Court decisions. Legal scholars began analyzing what they called the Crockett Standard, the idea that public officials, including judges, should be held accountable for inconsistencies between their current positions and their previous statements. Law schools incorporated Crockett's testimony into their curricula. In constitutional law classes across the country, professors used it as an example of effective legal argumentation and the importance of judicial consistency. What Representative Crockett did, explained a professor at Georgetown Law, was demonstrate the power of holding powerful people to their own standards. She didn't impose her values on Justice Alito. She held him to his own stated values. That's incredibly effective advocacy for Jasmine Crockett. Personally, the testimony transformed her national profile. She went from being a relatively unknown freshman representative to one of the most recognized voices in Congress. Speaking invitations poured in. She was featured on major news programs and late-night talk shows. But Crockett remained focused on the substance. In interviews, she consistently brought the conversation back to voting rights and judicial accountability. "This isn't about me," she told one interviewer. "It's about making sure that all Americans, regardless of their background or which party they support, can trust that our legal system is fair and consistent." The story of Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Justice Alito's reasoning doesn't end with the hearing. In many ways, it was just the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, other members of Congress began following Crockett's example. When the Supreme Court issued controversial opinions, representatives and senators started systematically comparing them to previous court decisions and the justices' own past statements. This new form of accountability, what some called jurisprudential fact-checking, changed the public discourse around the Supreme Court. Americans became more aware of inconsistencies and more willing to question judicial reasoning, even from the highest court in the land. Justice Alito never publicly responded to Crockett's testimony, but legal observers noted that in subsequent opinions, he and other conservative justices began including more extensive explanations for any apparent departures from previous reasoning. Whether this was a direct result of Crockett's challenge or simply coincidence, it represented a subtle but significant shift in how the court justified its decisions. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Judge Alito's legal reasoning offers several important lessons for American democracy. Crockett's effectiveness came from meticulous preparation. She didn't rely on talking points or political rhetoric. She had documents, citations, and evidence. In an age of social media sound bites, she proved that detailed, substantive arguments can still cut through the noise. By focusing on inconsistencies rather than ideological disagreements, Crockett made an argument that resonated across party lines. People from different political perspectives could agree that public officials should be consistent in their stated principles. Challenging a Supreme Court justice is politically risky. Crockett knew she would face criticism and attacks, but she did it anyway because she believed it was necessary. That kind of courage is essential for a healthy democracy. Even though Supreme Court justices have lifetime appointments, they are not immune to public scrutiny. When millions of Americans watched Crockett's testimony and understood the contradictions she highlighted, it created pressure for greater judicial accountability. The people's voice still matters. As a civil rights attorney who had spent years in courtrooms, Crockett brought both technical legal expertise and understanding of how judicial decisions affect real people. That combination made her arguments both legally sound and emotionally compelling. Months after that explosive hearing, one question continued to dominate legal and political discussions. Will the Supreme Court respond to this new era of accountability? Some observers were optimistic. They pointed to the court's slightly more detailed explanations in recent opinions as evidence that the justices were taking public scrutiny seriously. Others were skeptical. They argued that without formal mechanisms for accountability, like term limits, ethics codes, or enhanced transparency requirements, nothing would fundamentally change. What everyone agreed on was that Jasmine Crockett had changed the conversation. She had shown that it was possible to challenge the Supreme Court effectively using the tools of legal reasoning and public discourse. And perhaps most importantly, she had reminded Americans that in a democracy, no one, not even Supreme Court justices, is beyond accountability. Today, the debate over Supreme Court accountability continues. Justice Alito remains on the bench, issuing opinions that continue to draw both praise and criticism. Jasmine Crockett remains in Congress, continuing to fight for voting rights and civil rights. The specific voting rights case that sparked Crockett's testimony has inspired new legal challenges. Civil rights organizations have filed lawsuits in multiple states arguing that the Supreme Court's reasoning was flawed and that federal voting rights protections remain necessary. Meanwhile, the debate over judicial reform has intensified. Some advocates call for Supreme Court term limits. Others push for expansion of the court. Still others focus on ethics reforms and transparency requirements. What's clear is that the conversation has shifted thanks in large part to Jasmine Crockett's testimony. Americans are more engaged with Supreme Court decisions, more willing to scrutinize judicial reasoning, and more committed to demanding accountability from all branches of government. Years from now, when legal historians look back at this moment, they'll likely identify Jasmine Crockett's testimony as a turning point, not because it immediately changed Supreme Court practices, but because it fundamentally changed public expectations. Before Crockett, many Americans viewed the Supreme Court as an institution beyond criticism, its decisions as final and unquestionable. After Crockett, that myth was shattered. She proved that Supreme Court justices could be held accountable not through impeachment or removal, but through rigorous analysis of their own words and reasoning. She showed that one person, armed with evidence and courage, could challenge even the most powerful legal authority in the country. That's a legacy that will endure long after the specific legal battles of this moment have been resolved. The story of Jasmine Crockett outsmarting Justice Alito's legal reasoning is ultimately a story about the power of preparation, the importance of consistency, and the necessity of accountability in a democracy. It's a reminder that in America, even the most powerful institutions must answer to the people. It's a demonstration that effective advocacy requires both technical expertise and moral courage. And it's proof that one person speaking truth to power can make a difference. Whether you agree with Crockett's politics or Alito's judicial philosophy, the confrontation between them represents something essential to American democracy. The belief that no one is above scrutiny, that all public officials must be held to their stated principles, and that the people have both the right and the responsibility to demand accountability from their government. In that congressional hearing room, with cameras rolling and millions watching, Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge a Supreme Court justice's opinion. She reinforced a fundamental American principle that government of the people, by the people, and for the people means holding the powerful accountable always. That's a lesson worth remembering, no matter which side of the political aisle you're on. Thanks for reading this incredible story. If you found Jasmine Crockett's takedown as powerful as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another explosive political showdown. Drop a comment below telling us what you think. Did Crockett make a convincing case? Should Supreme Court justices face more accountability? We want to hear your thoughts.